because we're featuring your artwork in our virtual exhibition that we're going to have highlighting healthcare professionals and healthcare professionals who do artwork during the COVID-19 experience. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being open for this interview and sharing your artwork with us.
Hi, Azalea. Thank you so much for showing my artwork and interviewing me. I really appreciate it. It's quite an honor. So my name is Mike Natter. I'm a physician in New York City. I'm currently in my fellowship to become an endocrinologist. I am born and raised in New York City. My background is in the fine arts, and I did a bit of a 180, and I did a post-bac pre-med program and went into medicine, largely because of my own childhood diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, and was in the kind of throes of COVID during my medicine residency in New York City. So had kind of a bit of a whirlwind experience for the last year or so.
What was it like being, I mean, when we first found out that you were going to interview with us, we didn't even know that you were from New York City at that time. So when we heard that, we were like, oh my gosh, you must have some stories about the past year.
It was horrendous. So medical residency is 3 years, and I was burnt out by the kind of middle of my third year, and I was ready to be finished, and the spring hit. So before COVID was even there, I was just like done. You know, you're doing these 24-hour shifts and working 7-day weeks, and it's hard. And so I was very kind of ready to be finished with that chapter of my life. And then unfortunately we got, put into this position of dealing with a pandemic. But what I will say is there was and still is a fear, but then there's so much unknown. And I think that there was this palpable unease, because in medicine, usually when people come into the hospital, we know how we have the tools to figure out what they have, and we have the tools to address it. And very seldom, if ever, do we feel particularly exposed to becoming ill and dying from doing our jobs. And that was all kind of put on its head when COVID hit. And so it was particularly alarming. But on the flip side, there was also this gratitude I felt, and I know that my colleagues felt, for being able to have a skill set that allowed us to actually actively do something to try and help. So that was, it felt good that I was able to do that. That being said, I was absolutely petrified, and it was horrific seeing kind of what unfolded.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in the healthcare profession?
I'm born and raised in New York City, and I was always kind of surrounded by, creative outlets, museums and galleries, and I was always very drawn to the arts. And I was not particularly good and was quite scared of math and science. So I was kind of thought of as like the art kid and the humanities kid. And it wasn't really until I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 9, when I was introduced to what medicine was like. But again, because I was much more inclined toward the arts, I never thought that I could actually become a physician. I thought I wasn't smart enough or hardworking enough to do that. I kind of put it off or ignored it. And then in undergrad, where I was studying art, I took a few classes in neuroscience and became interested in the sciences, but again, didn't have that academic confidence until kind of the tail end of my academic career in undergrad. And I said, something, I am going to give this a go. I'm going to try and become a physician, and I'm going to try and become an endocrinologist specifically to see if I can help others who also deal with diabetes and other endocrinopathies. And to my surprise, it was actually my artistic background that helped me really learn medicine. And now I use it to teach medicine to medical students and residents and my patients and myself. And I also use it as a way to cope with some of the more emotional struggles that is, part of going through the training process.
So what was your family's reaction when you were all the way through the arts and you're like, what, I'm going to try medicine?
Oh, the massive relief! I'm a Jewish kid from the Upper West Side, so it's my parents' kind of dream to have a doctor in their family. And while they were always supportive of my creative drive and my interests, they always preferred it as more of a hobby and less of a career path. And to their credit, I didn't feel like I could make it into a career, so I never seriously considered art as a career path. But I didn't know what else I really enjoyed doing, really until the end of undergrad. And so they're very, very happy, very excited, very proud. But I think, I've been able to and grateful for intertwining my art into my medicine. And I very much identify as both an artist and a physician. And because of those two, I think that's why I'm able to kind of make it through my training process and practice medicine.
Can you tell us about a challenging time you've experienced during the last year, during the pandemic?
There were many. So there was many challenging times. I think dealing with so much death, the volume of death and the way in which these people were dying and doing so alone was really difficult. And I think that has left some pretty deep scars that I still think I'm processing and dealing with. So just in general, I'd say that was pretty horrific.
Is there a support system out there for physicians or for anyone in the medical field? Like, do you feel like even if there isn't one structured, is there some kind of support system that you turned to in that time?
There are definitely the different programs will kind of have different offerings, and so I know that at my program they do have these kind of counseling sessions and opportunities to kind of meet with therapists and so on. For me, and I'm actually actively looking for a therapist currently, but for me, my art has always been very cathartic for me, and so I kind of came back to drawing when I would come back from a tough shift or when I was going through some stuff. So I think having a therapist is good for everyone, but especially when dealing with these kinds of traumas, I think it's important.
What inspired you to kind of combine your love of art and medicine and create the comics and graphics that you do create?
Drawing has always been like a natural extension of everything I was doing, and I was doing more kind of fine arts as I was growing up, and then my art kind of shifted in medical school to more illustrative and more cartoon and more comic like. I would be studying in medical school, and it would be those doodles that I would remember during the exam. And that's when I kind of had that aha moment where, I learned by creating illustrations, and I started to just draw my notes. And so it was very kind of didactic initially. And then as I went through more of the kind of clinical rotations and residency, it became more of this kind of emotional crutch or this catharsis, where you would start to see suffering, death, or in some cases, kind of what we describe as like malignant teaching styles, where, attendings and the surgery, rotation in the operating room would yell at you or throw things at you or whatever it would be. And you would feel very small and very insignificant and wouldn't know how to process those things. And what I found, which I always think is like the best compliment, is when I put something out there and someone else in the medical training world says, "Oh my God, that resonates. Like I have the same experience, and like thank you for illustrating that, because I thought I was alone in those feelings." And you realize how it becomes very universal. What you think you're alone in feeling is actually quite common.
What does your artwork represent, and does your art represent something about you?
I'd like to think that my art is a pretty thinly veiled kind of depiction of my life. I just basically end up kind of poking fun and pointing out my own insecurities in my art often. And I do it, tongue in cheek, but also hopefully to make a commentary about a larger point that I think is kind of salient within the medical culture. I definitely think that my art is very much me and who I am. And I think I hope it comes across as that.
So when you're ready to begin doing an art piece, or you decide, I want to make an art piece about this experience I had or this feeling that I'm feeling, what's your process to start that? Do you do an outline? Do you do in pencil and then digital? Like, what is that process?
It's a great question. I love hearing other people talk about their process. And I always ask that. And then when people ask about mine, I realize, I have such a horrible answer to that, because my process is so on the fly. And I find that there's this space where the idea is born, and it's the space where I'm busy enough that I'm not trying to think of something, but still have enough like downtime in my brain to come up with the idea. So it's often when I'm doing something else, when I'm at the hospital, seeing a patient, walking down the street, in the shower, and I'll be like, that's clever, that's funny. Alternatively, it could be literally trying to depict an emotion or a situation that I had lived through or just went through that was emotionally complex, heavy, or otherwise kind of weighing on me. So then that's the seed, and then I try to plant it, and I tend to think in images. So I know some folks will write out things in words or type things up like outlines, but I tend to start to scribble down a shape, and I then will go from there. And oftentimes words or speech bubbles and so on will come later. Or oftentimes they'll end up in the trash, and it'll be this great idea in my head. And then when I put it down on paper, it's horrible. Alternatively, I've had the opposite happen where I'll draw something that I think the idea is kind of crap, and I draw it, and then it ends up being rather popular or interesting or resonates with someone. So it's a little bit of luck of the draw, but I'm someone that will just kind of jump into the illustration and then go from there. I wish that there was some rhyme or reason to it, but like there could be times when there'll be a very simple illustration that I want to draw, and my hand and the pen just won't agree. And then there'll be something, I'll just sit down and like it'll just flow out of me, and I have no explanation for how or why.
You mentioned previously that you have a fine arts background. So why do you choose the current materials that you use now for your art versus any kind of other things like sculpture or painting?
A lot of it kind of was born out of necessity. Like what I loved and was drawn to, especially in art school, was large scale charcoal drawings. And I loved the human form, and I loved figure drawing, and I loved kind of pulling out lights and darks using charcoal. But a few things to be able to do that: you need to have space, you need to be able to get kind of messy, and you need to have a lot of time. And those in New York City are three things that I don't have. So I realized that in order to truncate the time, the messiness, and the size, illustration kind of lent itself to that. And I always thought I was an artist, but one of my artist friends said to me, "You're an illustrator." And I said, "Oh, I am an illustrator, aren't I?" Like I really wanted, I think I wanted to be thought of as a fine artist, but even though that's what I was drawing, kind of like, studying in undergrad, the people in my undergrad art studios were like real artists. Like they were making beautiful pieces, and I always thought my stuff was kind of crap compared to theirs. But then when you meld in the purpose of why you're illustrating something, in terms of if you're trying to show something, I like to say that I was using medicine is very, very complex, and it's its own language. And I used to say that, or I like to think of it as medicine is a complex language that I had to basically translate into my own visual jargon in order to understand it. And, I also like to make the analogy to IKEA furniture comes with a instruction booklet that's entirely in pictures and has no words. And what that does is it breaks down any barriers to language issues, to reading issues, to education level, to really anything. And it makes it understandable. And I don't see why medicine shouldn't be that for initially for myself, but then for the patients, for medical students, for residents, and so on. And so that's what my goal typically is when I'm trying to illustrate something. And for me, the best kind of vehicle for that, especially now since things like social media are all digital, is quick, simple illustrations, and digital illustrations kind of have that appeal. And now with the technology, you can draw the same way you would draw on paper effectively on a screen, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. And so more recently, I've been kind of focusing on more of the digital art.
What does your art mean to you?
What does my art mean to me? I think it means a few things. My art tends to fall in a few different buckets. So there's the very purely, I'm drawing this to learn it bucket. There's the didactic bucket. I need to know this for medicine and for my test and for patient care. And then there's also the cathartic bucket, and that's me trying to work through emotional situations. And that's really powerful for me in a very different way. And, when you go through some of the things that you see in the hospital, when you have these emotional experiences, you often can't articulate what you're feeling. It's not something that has a word or a real phrase that can really communicate that. And it sits with you, and it's heavy. And for me to kind of relieve that weight, I can illustrate that. And it's often not so much the product of that illustration, but more the process of what I'm going through that helps me kind of work through that. And that's, to me, invaluable, because it's healing, or I'm trying to heal, or I guess some would say self-care. And then there's other illustrations or pieces that I might do that will talk about issues that are broader than that are dealing with social justice or with the medical system. And I might use humor to poke fun at that, or I might use, a little bit more kind of graphic novel style storytelling and narratives to talk about that. And that's important, and I think in a different way. And I think, if I'm able to, I don't ever think any of my illustrations can ever impact change necessarily, but if I'm able to have an impact on just one person who sees my work and it makes them feel better, make them happier, or make them think something different than what they initially thought in a positive way, then that for me is extremely motivating and makes me feel really good. I was told most of my kind of early academic career that I wouldn't make it. I wouldn't get into medical school. I wouldn't be a good doctor. I should cut losses. And I like to like impose that or not impose that, but I'd like to tell people that don't listen to that. And, I think it's easy to see the end product. Like, I'm a physician now and I'm able to make my art and so on. But at the same time, like there was so much that hard work and time that took to get to that point. And all of that time and hard work was laden with self-doubt and, wanting to quit and feeling though I wasn't good enough and having horrible imposter syndrome, which I still do. But I would want to tell that kid who was told that they can't, that they can. But I want people to feel empowered and not be told that they can't do something when they can.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Natter. We really appreciate your time. We're so excited.
Yeah, thank you so much for being flexible and rescheduling and joining us.
It's my pleasure. Nice to meet you guys. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.
You too. Take care.
Bye.